Hello, my name is Wischin. I'm co-editor of the philosophical research bulletin Disputatio out of the University of Salamanca in Spain. Brandom's philosophy of rational pragmatism and inferential semantics has been with us for quite a while now. There is one aspect of Brandom's philosophy that has not been discussed thoroughly enough, in my opinion. And that is why I asked Professor Brandom if he would like to contribute to a special issue of Disputatio that investigated the relationship between the philosophies of Ludwig Wittgenstein, particularly his later philosophy, and the rational pragmatism that Brandom is proposing. And Professor Brandom was quite enthusiastic about it from the very beginning. He allowed us to publish in a bilingual form an older essay of his asserting, and then contributed with a fresh piece that addressed exactly the issue that we had at hand. And then it occurred to us that maybe we could also conduct an interview to be published in the same issue. This interview was conducted by Maria Jose Frapolli in the summer of 2018, but it has not been until now that this interview has been made available to the public. While Robert Brandom does not really need to be introduced, I will take liberty in saying a few words now about his development as a philosopher. After this, I will invite Maria Jose Frapolli to say a few words in order to give a general impression of his philosophy. Robert Boyce Brandom, born in Buffalo, New York, United States of America in 1950, is an American philosopher, currently Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh and a member of the Faculty of Philosophy there since 1976. He completed his bachelor in philosophy at Yale and obtained a PhD under the direction of Richard Rorty at the Princeton University. He has given the John Locke Lectures at Oxford, the Hempel Lectures at Princeton, the Howison and Townsend Lectures at Berkeley, a William James Lecture at Harvard, and the Woodbridge Lectures at Columbia. He has held fellowships at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Science at Stanford and at All Souls College in Oxford. In 2002, he was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2004, he received the Distinguished Achievement in the Humanities Award from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, amounting to $1.5 million. Brandom is at home in the tradition of pragmatism and analytical philosophy, but he sees himself also in significant ways as an heir to the rationalist school of thought as exemplified by Kant and Hegel, as Jürgen Habermas took note on the other side of the Atlantic soon after the publication in 1994 of Brandom's programmatic masterpiece, Making It Explicit. While working out the details of his normative pragmatism and inferentialist semantics, he also builds on Frege and Wittgenstein, and he argues with contemporary thinkers such as Davidson and Dummett, as well as his teachers, Sellers and Rorty. Following an anthology put together by Bernhard Weiss and Jeremy Wanderer, he might be the first to give a systematic and rigorous attempt to account for the meaning of linguistic items in terms of their socially norm-governed use, relying on a non-representationalist explanation of intentionality and rational pragmatics. A long list of books, articles, and conferences followed after Making It Explicit, as articulating reasons between saying and doing, from empiricism to expressivism, or wieder erinnerte Idealismus. It seems that Brandom is able to develop new thoughts and put them to print faster than many of us can read. A more comprehensive description of Brandom's life, work, and interests may be found in the general introduction to the monograph where this interview has been published in written form. I will now ask Maria Jose Frapolli to say a few words in order to give a very general description of the philosophy Robert Brandom has developed.
Thank you, Kurt, and hello, everybody. I'm Maria Jose Frapolli, and I'm going to interview Professor Robert Brandom on the occasion of this special issue of Disputatio, devoted to the philosophy of Wittgenstein and Brandom. I don't know that what I'm going to do is giving an overview, because even a brief one would be something extremely difficult. But I would like to say something. I would like to give you some clues about the main interests that have guided me in my choice of the questions. Robert Brandom's contribution to contemporary philosophy, that we might call inferential pragmatism, is a complex combination of several intertwined theses: semantic inferentialism, logical and normative expressivism, methodological pragmatism, and normative pragmatism. Many there are some others. The central aim of inferential pragmatism is understanding and explaining what it is for a creature to be rational, and how the notion of conceptual content possessed by some of our acts, utterances, claims, and expressions can be articulated. I don't think it is risky to say that the point of departure of Brandom's system is the idea that being consumers and producers of reasons, that is, being involved in actions with conceptual content, is what distinguishes us, the ones who say we, from other animals. In Brandom's system, they converge different philosophical schools and streams of thought that have defined modern and contemporary philosophy, and among others, and to focus on the 20th century, a substantial part of analytic philosophy and of American pragmatism flow into Brandom's system. Brandom has been enormously generous in stressing at almost every step of the development of his philosophy that he stands on the shoulders of giants, and he mentions Kant, Hegel, Frege, Wittgenstein, Dammit, Sellars, Rorty, Davison, and some others. But still, his proposal involves, as I said, a clear discontinuity with the standard approaches to language and normativity proper of the 20th century. Inferential pragmatism implies a reinterpretation of almost everything that is important in philosophy. In particular, many classical dichotomies in terms of art, familiar to all of us, become massively redefined. Some examples are the contrast between descriptive and normative, and also facts and norms, and his expressive approach to logical, epistemic, and semantic concepts, such as, for instance, negation, conditional, knowledge, belief, truth, reference, etc. And in spite of this discontinuity that I have already mentioned, Brandom insists on the use of the old terms and the old dichotomies, together with some new ones, which might make it difficult to appreciate his proposal's radical tone. With this interview, I aim at understanding and testing the limits of Brandom's pragmatism, and getting clearer about the depth of his revolution in semantics and pragmatics, which I consider to be unrivaled in contemporary philosophy. Good morning, Professor Brandom. Hi, Bob. As you know, I have prepared 10 questions divided into 4 groups. The first group is metaphysics and anthropology. The second group, semantics and pragmatics. The third group is epistemic expressivism. And the fourth group is philosophy of logic. Okay, so my first question has 2 related parts. Is about the distinction between sapience and sentience. So the question is whether the distinction between sapience and sentience is, in classical terms,
normative or descriptive, that is, whether it could be modified as the result of further developments in ethology, biology, or animal psychology, for instance. The point of my question is not whether we are allowed to attribute conceptual contents to animals, to big apes, but whether, given what we know now about the complexities of the communities, in which they seem to use norms, and they seem to acknowledge the social status of different members of the group, given this situation, if you think that we could say that in their communicative activities, they sort of entertain some kind of conceptual content. This is the first part. And the second part is whether the distinction between sapience and sentience is absolute or admit fuzzy borders. The answer of this second part is surely related to your kind of holism, because a moderate holism could allow a soft division and a gradual approach to the full category of sapience, whereas a radical holism, a complete holism, would make the divide sharp. I would like to know what is your position at this point.
Okay. There is a tension methodologically in my work between my pragmatism and my rationalism. The pragmatism generally counsels not making sharp distinctions, but seeing intermediate cases, seeing everything as up for grabs in principle. The rationalism, on the other hand, depends on sort of making sharp distinctions, saying, look, this follows and this other doesn't. And there is a tension between these, but this is one point on which I'm a rationalist. I think of the line between sapience and non-sapience as a sharp, bright line. The question just is whether the practices or activities that the creatures in question engage in exhibit the right structure. And it's got to be it's a very complicated structure. They have to engage in norm-governed practices. They have to attribute to each other normative statuses and adopt normative attitudes towards one another. That's something that I think the more capable sorts of non-human animals are able to do. They can engage in norm-governed activity. This is something that I talked about at length with Michael Tomasello when he visited at the University of Pittsburgh for a year. And I think he's shown the normative character of the interactions of some of the primates that he talks with. But the sort of structure that's needed for that norm-governed practice to be discursive practice is very complicated. It's basically the one I describe in Making It Explicit. So for instance, it's not enough that creatures distinguish between what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. That is, those two normative statuses. They have to distinguish between commitments and entitlements, two different kinds of normative status. And in particular, the question of whether one is entitled to a certain commitment has to be something that they can practically make sense of. Those statuses have to be inferentially articulated so that it has to be part of their practice that undertaking one commitment has consequences for other commitments, consequences for what else you're entitled to, that you have to distinguish between what would and what wouldn't entitle you to a particular commitment. So the commitments and entitlements have to be inheritable in these various broadly inferential ways, and they also have to be inheritable by testimony. Okay. So pragmatically, what structure a set of implicitly normative social practices has to have to count as discursive practices, it's a very high bar. But it's also a bright line. So I think there's no question that non-human primates do not exhibit practices of the right sort of complexity to be discursive practices. I don't think there's any evidence that they keep separate track of commitments and entitlements, of the inheritance of them in this inferentially articulated way. Again, in these discussions with Michael Tomasello, he agreed that the sorts of things that he's seeing as proto-linguistic among chimpanzees, for instance, don't yet get into the territory that I count as required for it to be genuinely linguistic, discursive activity.
Thank you very much. And now my second question is more or less the same question, but at the other end of the spectrum. Not about great apes, but about artificial intelligence, and so neural nets and supercomputers. The question again is whether you think that artificial neural nets can deal with some kind of conceptual content, and as in the former question, whether the distinction between them and us is could be fuzzy or gradual, and could be modified as the result of some developments in computer sciences. But let me elaborate a little bit the context, focusing on three parts: on inferential semantics, on the socio-normative aspects, and on updating. I think that the justification at the level of inferential semantics seems to be easier. So because we say that computers make inferences, that they can draw a conclusion from premises and so on and so forth. And at every step, the program determines the steps which are reachable. And we might understand this reachability as the entitlements, for instance, and the step of derivation that are precluded. So there is a sense in which we could individuate information by its place in an inferential network. Less natural is to identify the socio-normative aspects that would justify the attribution to computers of normative statuses, of course. But nevertheless, we can think of groups of interconnected computers, neural nets, server farms, as units that exchange information, that give and take information from other computers and also from human users. And I'm sure that the algorithms could detect the relative reliability of different sources, and also sort of recognize the authority of some sources, for instance, the authority of their programmers, because they use some password to intervene in the system. And the third aspect is learning or updating. If I understood you correctly, I think that your criticism in between saying and doing against the whole project of artificial intelligence has to do with your impression that computers are not sensitive to contextual information. But it seems that currently experts in computing and neural nets seem to think otherwise. A standard negative answer, of course, would appeal to consciousness or something like that, but you have rejected this kind of answer for the cases of the parrot and the thermostat, and for good reasons. So what is your point here? Because in this case, the neural nets, this case, they do have the much more complexity probably than communities of great apes. What is your opinion?
Yes, well, as you suggested, one of the consequences of sharply distinguishing sapience from sentience is to reject the sort of argument that John Searle has made, that artificial intelligence without sentience is unintelligible. That's what I take the basis of the appeals to consciousness to be, that they're thinking, no, sentience is an essential presupposition of sapience, And as you point out, I reject that.
Mhm.
And so in principle, for me, there is no reason why electronic computers could not be discursive creatures. The mere fact that they're not biological organisms does not entail that for me. There's two questions that I think it's important to separate. One is whether a computer could become a practitioner, a participant in our discursive practices. And the second is whether a group of computers or a group of interacting programs within one physical machine, that doesn't make a difference, but whether they could interact in such a way as to be, as to confer propositional and conceptual content on the messages they sent back and forth to each other, independently of any interaction with us. That is, could they do what we do in that sense, in the sense that their practices were sufficient to confer meanings, to institute conceptually contentful discursive statuses. So that's a much more challenging question than the question of whether they could come to be participants in our practices, that is, able to use expressions that we had made meaningful, even though the computer wasn't capable of making it meaningful. And I don't see reasons in principle why either of those is impossible.
Okay.
Now, I do think that the most challenging barrier to get over in doing this is the non-monotonic character of our reasoning. The way in which, though a certain inference may be good, when we're given a new piece of information, that may make the inference no longer good. In the largest sense, I think this is what the discussion within computer science of the frame problem has been getting at. In order to reason and so to think, one has to ignore a lot of things that are going on, a lot of beliefs that one has. Precisely because the inferences that matter are non-monotonic. So one has to not be worried about the possibility of infirming additional premises until and unless they're actually brought out onto the table to be discussed. Strange as it may seem, this capacity to ignore potentially relevant considerations until they become actually relevant, that capacity not to pay attention to things, but to not pay attention to things, that's very difficult to implement in a way that will allow one to reason in the proper non-monotonic way. We don't have good formal representations of the non-monotonicity of material inference. And this, I think, is the biggest technical challenge to getting computers either to be able to participate as full-fledged members of our discursive communities, or us programming them to be able to form their own communities, which would confer content. Now, I said I thought the first of those was easier. The computers already are second-class members of our discursive community. We can use them for all sorts of helpful purposes, and surely that's going to continue apace. just using them and their recognitional capacities to extend our senses, treating them as reporters of phenomena, this is already something we've made great strides with. I do think it's important to temper our enthusiasm for the neural network form, the deep learning form of artificial intelligence. It's been very exciting because that form of parallel distributed processing, when combined with big data, has turned out to be able to address topics and solve problems that classical von Neumann architectures that require explicit programming and formulation of rules were very bad at.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's not clear to me that these the issues that arise from the non-monotonicity of material inference, it's not clear to me that those issues are well addressed by the neural network pattern. It remains to be seen. Maybe so, in which case exciting things will happen soon. But it's possible that that just isn't a problem of the right shape for them to be good at. But I think we don't understand the structure of our own capacities in that regard well enough to be able to say. But the fact that the computers are machines with on-off switches and so on, this does not preclude them from, that's not the problem.
Okay, this is the second part on semantics and pragmatics, and I think that the questions here are easier or quicker. My third question is, as a pragmatist, you support the logical and chronological priority of propositions over concepts, which derives from the central status of that assertion language downtown has in linguistic practice, and also because you are a pragmatist, the dichotomy between semantics versus pragmatics is no longer a basic distinction in your view, even though you make a profuse methodological use of it. The preeminent status that assertion has in your view has made some authors, I'm thinking of Hugh Price, accuse you of some kind of monism, which contrasts with the pluralism attributed to Wittgenstein. So my question is, in your view, so do you consider your view monist from a semantic or pragmatic point of view? And if the answer is affirmative, in which sense? And if it is monist, how your monist could account for the obvious plurality of speech acts?
Well, this is another area where my pragmatism and my rationalism are in a certain tension. Wittgenstein has the picture of language as being a motley. There are many things we can do with it. It's not just that there aren't a small number of speech acts we can perform. It's an indefinitely extensible pragmatics that he sees, language as a motley. Whereas I have what I think is fairly called a monistic view, at least at base. I think what makes something a discursive practice is that you can say something in it, in the sense of making an assertion. Anything is a discursive practice if in that practice you can say that things are thus and so. As I said, that's what's required to confer that content on some speech act, to make it, in the proper sense, a speech act, a claiming. That's very complicated, but that's necessary and sufficient for something to be a discursive practice, in my understanding. All the other speech acts, I'm committed to understanding as a superstructure that we can make sense of ultimately in terms of our capacity to assert, to claim that things are thus and so. So, for instance, if we think about the slab Sprachspiel that Wittgenstein opens the investigations with, in my sense, a vocal game, but not really a verbal game. It's not a language game, properly so-called, because the commands that are given in it are not orders. They're vocalizations that are appropriately responded to by, for instance, doing something, by, for instance, bringing a slab. But to be an order, it's not enough to be an act or a performance that's appropriately responded to in some ways and not in others. It has to be that by saying how it's appropriate to respond to it. You can't say, shut the door, unless you can say the door is shut. You have to be able to assert that things are thus and so for some speech act to have the significance of commanding someone to make things thus and so. Similarly, for questions, you have to be able to give the answers in order to understand questions. Proper semantics of questions, I think, is a matter of what are responsive answers to different kinds of questions. So I've undertaken the very strong commitment that I claim to be able to make sense of discursive practices that only have assertions in them, and I'm committed to making sense of all the other things you can do with language as something that we can understand is built out of and built on top of the capacity to make those assertions. I think of this as good Popperian methodology. Make the strongest, most easily falsifiable claim that's compatible with what you know is true. This is how we will make progress. I would not be surprised to have people show me that you've got to have some other basic speech acts involved as well. I'm really pretty confident that no one's going to show that you don't need assertion to be in the game, but that you might need a lot more than that. I make the stronger claim because I don't see what the others are needed for, but I'm entirely open to finding that out, as I say, in the spirit of Popper.
Okay, thank you. And my fourth question is the following. In the notion of correct material inference that lies at the core of your inferential semantics, there is, as I see it, no room for a principal distinction between descriptive and normative terms, a distinction on which the bifurcation thesis, as used by Rorty and Price, for instance, rests. The thesis that there is a strict line to be drawn between descriptive and non-descriptive terms, or uses of terms, as Price prefers to say. Your normative pragmatism also assumes that normative notions, commitment and entitlements, are more fundamental than non-normative ones, which goes, in my opinion, again against the classical intuitions that support the bifurcation thesis. Instead, your approach to the meaning of normative terms makes use of a different dichotomy, because your normative expressivism needs the distinction between ground-level contents in material inferences and the expression of attitudes towards normative statuses and inferential connections, which is done by means of higher-level expressive terms. Now the question, do you think that the standard formulation of the bifurcation thesis should say something interesting? Do you think that we should keep this bifurcation thesis? And if the answer is affirmative, what would you say that it is the relationship between the classical bifurcation thesis and your distinction between ground level and expressive terms?
So, I mean, I think it's entirely compatible with a broadly Wittgensteinian pragmatism, which sees expressions as playing quite different expressive roles. Nonetheless, to try and say accurately and insofar as possible, systematically, what those expressive roles are. So one of the things I always found frustrating in reading the investigations was Wittgenstein's well-taken examples to make us realize that not every use of declarative sentences is in the fact-stating line of work, that not every use of singular terms is in the object-referring line of work. I thought all those points are well taken. I wanted him to tell me more about what the fact-stating line of work is. What is it to use a singular term as purporting to pick out a particular object? Okay, maybe pain talk doesn't do that, but doesn't do what exactly? And that's the sort of question that I set out to at least begin to answer in making it explicit. So when I look at the different expressive roles that vocabularies can play, it seems to me there are a number of quite different ones. In particular, Kant, I think, was the first one to realize that besides concepts whose basic use and expressive function is to describe and explain empirical goings-on, there are other concepts whose principal expressive role it is to make explicit features of the framework that makes it possible to describe and explain. And chief among the vocabularies that have that different framework explicating role, I think, are a lethic modal vocabulary that's making explicit the subjunctive robustness of material reasoning on the one hand, and normative vocabulary on the other hand. The normative vocabulary that I see as making explicit our commitment, our endorsement of, our commitment to the goodness of, our endorsement of patterns of practical reasoning. And it seems to me that it's the distinction between theoretical and practical reasoning, that is, reasoning whose conclusion is something assertable on the one hand, and reasoning whose conclusion is straight way to do something, as Aristotle more or less says, that is to perform some action which is not basically acclaiming. And I see the distinctive expressive role of normative vocabulary being to endorse patterns of practical reasoning. So the different senses of ought, for instance, the prudential or instrumental use of ought, the social practical use, and maybe a moral use, all correspond to endorsing different patterns of practical reasoning. So it seems to me a pragmatist can distinguish theoretical from practical reasoning by distinguishing assertions from other things. And then it's more or less a question of fact. Do we use normative vocabulary to express the goodness of, or at least to endorse the goodness of, patterns of practical reasoning? And if that is something we do with it, is that function sufficient to distinguish normative vocabulary as such? And I think the answer to those questions is yes. So I think it's a mistake to assimilate what we're doing when we use normative vocabulary to fact stating, to saying how the world is. That's not to say that there can't be any fact stating role for normative vocabulary, but that's not the home language game of normative vocabulary.
Okay. And deeply related to this question is the following, my fifth question, which is, as it happens with other classical dichotomies, your use of fact and factual versus norm and normative is non-standard. Facts are true claims, and what it is to be a fact has to be explained in normative terms. Then, if fact is a normative notion, the notion of fact is normative, what is the relevance of the standard distinction between factual and normative meaning, if any? So it's a different way of looking at the same problem.
Mm-hmm. So I have an extremely relaxed and elastic notion of fact, which simply reflects the notion of assertion. So to be assertable is to be, in the broadest sense, in the fact-stating line of work. A fact is a true claim in the sense of true claimable, not in the sense of a true claiming. And so to understand the notion of fact, one has to understand claimability, which one can't understand without understanding what one's doing in claiming something. One can't understand what one's doing in claiming something in non-normative terms. Claiming is undertaking a commitment. So one is not going to understand claimables without understanding claimings, and that's a normative notion. So sort of behind our descriptions of the empirical world are non-normative claims. There is this normative pragmatics. What we're doing in making those claims has to be understood in normative terms.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question of this block. Okay, so semantic inferentialism is essentially holistic. In order to possess one concept, one has to possess many. Semantic holism has been standardly criticized for the risk it involves of making communication impossible. You answer this criticism by stressing the role of anaphora in the task of securing the stability of contents. Now, we are here in front of another radical dichotomy, the dichotomy between semantic atomism, that you reject, and complete holism, that you seem to embrace. So you seem to have weakened your semantic holism, introducing the idea of the robustness of some material inferences. As I see it, radical holism is a very strong thesis that, to my mind, you don't need, and that cannot be founded on our real practices. And I will insist on this point in my last question. Could you explain what is your kind of holism, whether radical and complete or gradual and moderate?
This is a very complicated issue, and there's at least three things I'd like to say about it. The first is Sellers, my inspiration for the inferentialism, said that only some of the inferences that a concept is involved with are semantically constitutive of that content. It's all and only the counterfactually robust, the counterfactual supporting inferences that are essential to the content of the concept. and he so in the title of one of his essays, Concepts as Involving Laws and Inconceivable Without Them, he thought of that subjunctive robustness of the inferences as underwritten by laws, and so it's only the laws that articulate the concepts that are semantically essential. Now, I think that was a perfectly intelligible response to the total holism that says that all the inferences that a bit of vocabulary are involved in are equally essential to its vocabulary. So they're saying, no, only some of them, only these counterfactual supporting inferences are essential to it. Now, I don't think that subjunctive robustness always traces back to some law underlying things. I think statements of laws are limiting cases of subjunctive robustness, which is a ubiquitous phenomenon of material inference. That is, I make a certain inference, I say it's raining, so the streets will be wet. Now, it's an important part of understanding that I have some view about the range of subjunctive robustness of that inference. That if people had built awnings over the roads, it wouldn't go through. But if it's Tuesday, that isn't going to infirm the inference. I think that the right way to think about it is in terms of ranges of subjunctive robustness, that every inference is robust under some additional premises. And outside of mathematics and sort of fundamental physics, where the reasoning is mathematical, that no inferences are universally subjunctively robust. That is, all of them have some conditions of defeasibility. That's a matter of more or less. So I don't think that Seller's criterion draws a bright line and says, oh, only these inferences are part of the meaning, these others are not. I would rather say that the ranges of subjunctive robustness are part of what you need to master in order to master the use of a concept, but that's a more or less, a matter of more or less, not, again, a bright line. So that's one point. Second point is that the people who see semantic holism as potentially a threat to the intelligibility of communication are not thinking in normative terms. They're thinking about our dispositions to make inferences, and are saying, well, because you have different collateral beliefs than I do, just because we carve out different trajectories through the world, because we have different collateral beliefs, we're going to be disposed to endorse different inferences, and so they think mean different things according to the holistic principle. But meanings are not a matter of our dispositions, they're a matter of the norms that we bind ourselves by. You and I can bind ourselves by exactly the same norms when we say the coin is copper, even though your conception of what you're committing yourself to by saying it's copper may be very different from mine, and neither of us understands what we're really committing ourselves to as well as the metallurgist does. Those norms that we're binding ourselves by, those could be completely holistic in a radical sense, and it wouldn't keep you and me from communicating with each other as long as we're binding ourselves by the same norms. Okay. That's the second point. The third point is, but it seems to me that the notion of conceptual content is a ladder that we should climb up and then throw away after we've climbed up on it, to use Wittgenstein's metaphor, that the practical capacities to understand each other that we have are navigating between your conception of what you're committing yourself to by saying the coin is copper and mine. I need to be able to extract information from your remark. You're looking at the coin and I'm not. And I say, tell me about it. You say it's copper. Well, I need to be able to use your claim as a premise in my reasoning. And for that, the fact that you've bound yourself by this public norm in playing the counter copper, using the English word copper, that tells me a lot about what inferences I can make from it. But I'm going to appeal to sort of everything I know about the world and about you in order to make the practical judgment as to which of the things that I would take to follow if I were calling something copper are actually conclusions that I can draw from your calling it copper. This is a practical capacity to navigate between our different doxastic perspectives. And we're both committed to their, as I would say, to there being something that copper means, some norm that we've bound ourselves by. But it isn't actually that much help in the practical navigation. But what we want to do is understand that practical capacity. For instance, if a computer is going to get to be even a second-class interlocutor with us, not only do we have to be able to make inferences from its utterances, which we can already do pretty well, we sort of know what's behind the utterance of the computer, or Google when it tells me the answer to some question. But it's also going to have to be able to make this judgment. What inferences can it make from the things that we've said? That practical capacity to navigate between the perspectives. That's what's required for communication. And it's not clear to me why people think that, for instance, thinking of a proposition as a partition of an uncountably infinite universe of possible worlds into those in which the proposition is true and those in which it's not, why does that make it more intelligible that you and I can navigate across this gap when you say the coin is copper?
So this is the third block, epistemic expressivism. Epistemic concepts express attitudes toward normative statuses, either belonging to the speaker or attributed to a third party. The difference in the normative attitude to statuses entertained or attributed in attributions of knowledge and beliefs accounts for the difference in meaning between these two concepts. Attributing knowledge to someone is attributing to her a commitment and an entitlement to this commitment, and undertaking oneself the commitment to the content, which means taking the content as true. By contrast, in the attribution of belief, the attributor doesn't undertake the commitment to the content, and she doesn't need to take the content as true, even though this is not excluded. Now, let us focus on first-person assertions. Assertions are a way of expressing beliefs, and beliefs are the content of assertions. At the same time, you claim that placing assertion at the center of the linguistics practice that institutes significances and confers contents is, I quote, to treat the sort of claim involved in asserting as an implicit knowledge claim. All these things together mean that assertion are implicit knowledge claims in which beliefs are expressed. If we combine the roles of knowledge and belief with what you say about assertion, it follows that there is a sense in which an agent cannot distinguish between his assertion that he believes that P, his assertion that he knows that P, his assertion that P is true, and his assertion that P is true because in all these cases there is a commitment to P, and there must be at least a presumption of entitlement for this assertion to be successful. The result at this point is something like a semantic or pragmatic version of the Gettier insight, that the agent cannot distinguish between the circumstances in which he is entitled to assert knowledge and the circumstances that authorize him to merely claim belief. And the same goes for the consequences he is committed to by his assertion of knowledge and belief. You are aware of this consequence of your expressivist account of epistemic concept. My question is, if the meaning of knowledge and belief can only be seen in third-person attributions, what is the role of those first-person claims that include epistemic terms? In particular, do you think that epistemic terms in first and third-person claims have the same meaning?
Well, same meaning is not one of my words.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, I think they're first and third person versions of one claim, and that it's essential to the terms like knowledge and belief meaning what they do, that they have both first and third person uses that are related in just the way they're related. So maybe an example would be that there's a sense in which when I say something, I am confused, and when you utter the same words, there's a sense in which we're expressing the same thought and a sense in which we're not. And when I say, when you say, meaning to be a same-sayer with me, you're confused. I've said I'm confused. We can say, well, do those two statements have the same meaning, or are they just intimately related in what they mean in such a way that we can understand both of them? And I don't think in the end it matters which of those we say, as long as we can describe the practices. So that's basically what you've asked me to do here for the case of, let's just say, knowledge and belief. And I think we can address the question along two fronts, pragmatic force and semantic content. So you've got me quite right in thinking that knowledge and belief, what you're doing in attributing knowledge and belief is distinguishable only in the third person, case. The fact that to learn to use these words, one needs to learn the third person use, means that one has that available in one's own case. Crucially, to talk about one's past beliefs. So I can, in a first person case, say, look, I used to believe that copper had a higher melting point than aluminum, but now I know that it doesn't. That's basically a third person attitude towards my own beliefs, because it's not my current beliefs, but because I'm able to take up that third person point of view and make the distinction to other people, I can make it in my own case too. And because I can do it for my past commitments, that's what makes it possible for me to entertain the possibility that though I believe it, it might not be true. What I'm doing is imagining my future self being in this position with respect to my present self. So this is all at the level of force. But there's a level of, at the level of content, I can distinguish really quite apart from the considerations I was just rehearsing. When I have the expressive resources to make ascriptions, including first-person ascriptions of belief and knowledge explicit, so ascribing them, not just attributing them, as I use the terms in making it explicit. Now we can see a difference between P, the claim that P, the claim I believe that P, and the claim I know that P. Let me just talk about the claim, sort of the coin is copper, and I believe that the coin is copper. And we say, well, to grasp the content of those claims is to know what follows from them and what's incompatible with them. But very different things are incompatible with the claim the coin is made of copper and the claim I believe that the coin is made of copper. For instance, Brandom never existed is incompatible with the claim I believe that the coin is copper, but it's not incompatible with the claim the coin is copper. So those two claims, the coin is copper and I believe that the coin is copper, those have very different meanings for me. Different things follow from them, different things are incompatible with them. So even at the level of content, when I look at I believe that P and I know that P, well, from I know that P, it follows that P. If I know that the coin is copper, it follows that the coin is copper. It doesn't follow from I believe that the coin is copper, that the coin is copper. Different, as I say, different things are incompatible, different things follow. So these different epistemic statuses are distinguishable in the level of force, but they're distinguishable in the level of content as well. And in the second half of the 8th chapter of Making It Explicit, I show that the way I've introduced explicit ascriptions confers different inferential roles on them than for all ascriptions than any of the underlying claims. So that even though it's a social practice account of what you're doing in claiming, it confers content on those claims that isn't equivalent to the content of any claims about what anybody believes.
Okay, so related to this question, I'm thinking of Ramsey. So a possible answer to the previous question is to acknowledge that terms such as knowledge and belief are ambiguous, sort of between let's say an absolute semantic pragmatic sense used to make explicit attitudes on the one hand, and a, let's say, psychological sense in which they represent something like Ramseyan degrees of belief, whose function might be expressing the subjective confidence of the agent in his reasons or evidence. Would you be prepared to accept this alternative meaning for first-person epistemic claims? If so, how would you say that the two senses, the semantic pragmatic proper of attributions and the psychological related to first-person claims, are related?
Of course, officially, belief is not one of my words. Commitment is. And I don't think of commitment as coming in degrees. It seems to me that what the Ramseyan talk about degrees of belief is the phenomenon that it's trying to capture, is the phenomenon that I referred to earlier under the rubric range of subjunctive robustness of an inference. So, when I make a claim, let's say as the conclusion of an inference, I'm aware that there are many things that could infirm the inference that I meant, that I made. I have not made a study of all of the potential diffeasors so that I can say, and look, I know that none of those diffeasors hold. I think of what Ramsey is trying to express by saying, well, I'm not very confident in this belief. I have only a certain small degree of belief in it, is trying to cover with, trying to represent with real numbers between 0 and 1, this much more complicated algebraic situation in which the inferential procedure that led me to this conclusion is defeasible by lots of other things that could be, that could turn out to be true. I think what we need to do is get a better way of representing than we have now those ranges of subjunctive robustness, which I'm acknowledging when I say, well, when I use a ceteris paribus clause or say, look, this is the conclusion I draw, but it might not be right. I'm really acknowledging that I haven't looked into all the possible defeating circumstances and ruled them out. And I'd rather talk about that actual range of possible defeaters rather than put a probability or credence measure on something. So I think there's a real phenomenon there, but degrees of belief is giving it the wrong algebraic structure.
And we have just 2 questions left on philosophy of logic. And so my first question about philosophy of logic is the following. I mean, I'm interested in the effect of considering inference a more basic notion than truth in the philosophy of logic. So in the philosophy of logic, there is a basic distinction between valid arguments, those in which the conclusion is a necessary consequence of premises, and sound arguments, those valid arguments with true premises. In semantic inferentialism, the notion of inference is more basic than the notion of truth. Being taken as true is being usable as a premise and or being the conclusion of a correct material inference. Naturally, we must maintain the difference between being true or being correct and being taken as true or as correct, as Wittgenstein stressed. But this, as I see it, this can only be done from the third-person perspective, in which the attributor expresses her attitude towards the commitments and entitlements of the subject who is carrying on an inference. An attributor can reject an inference endorsed by a third party for several reasons. For instance, she might see that the attributee is entitled to his commitment with his premises without being committed herself to them. And she can reject the normative connection between premises and conclusion by rejecting that commitment to the premises entitles the commitment to the conclusion. So all this is clear. There is no problem here. Nevertheless, in the realm of logic, the contrast between first and third person perspective disappears. We might, again, in a Ramseyan vein, distinguish degrees of assertive character. That is, we might support some premises merely as conjectures, only to see what follows from them, or, on the other hand, of the other end of the spectrum, as something about which the subject is absolutely sure, etc. But I cannot see how this gradation could be projected into the realm of logic. Do you think that within the realm of logical theory, the distinction between valid and sound inferences is a relevant one? And if so, how could inferentialism explain it?
Okay. So Dummett had already argued that it was a mistake to think of logic in terms of truth as the study of a distinctive kind of truth, logical truth, that the traditional understanding of logic as the study of consequence was surely the correct one. And he points to the fact that we're familiar with logics that have the same set of theorems, but different consequence relations. And we think of them as different logics in that case. And I think he's perfectly right about that. But Dummett goes on to characterize logic as the study of a particular kind of consequence, namely logical consequence. And I think that's wrong. I don't think logic is the study of logical inference, and I don't think that it's a canon of right reasoning for any inferences. I think that logic is the study of the use of vocabulary to make inferences explicit. That is, a vocabulary that has this distinctive expressive role of letting us reason about reasoning. But its job is not to tell us of this non-logical reasoning, which it's helping us express. Its job is not to tell us which of those are good and which aren't. Its job is just to let us make explicit, make claimable, assertable claims about what follows from what and what's incompatible with what. That's why I think the conditional and negation are the fundamental bits of logical vocabulary. The conditional that lets us talk about inferential consequence relations, and negation that lets us talk about material incompatibilities of things. The distinction between logically valid reasoning and reasoning that isn't logically valid doesn't come up for ground level material inferences. What we have there is the distinction, as you suggested in your question, between counterfactual reasoning, reasoning where I say, well, I'm reasoning under supposition, where I'm not endorsing the premises, I'm exploring them. Let's see what one would be committing oneself to if one were to assert this claim. I think that distinction between reasoning under supposition, counterfactual reasoning, on the one hand, and reasoning where one endorses the premises and may or may not endorse the conclusion, because some material reasoning is permissive rather than committive. But in any case, where one endorses the distinction between reasoning where one endorses the premises and reasoning where one doesn't, that's a real distinction at the ground level. I know you, Maria, remember that Frege claimed that you couldn't make inferences from premises that one didn't regard as true.
Sure.
That what one was doing in that case was considering true conditionals that had the apparent premises as the antecedents of them. I think that it's at the level of conditionals that we see what's common to counterfactual reasoning and indicative reasoning, because we can formulate both of them in the form of conditionals and look at the different behavior of those conditionals. I don't think that the principal philosophical interest of logic is in logically good inferences. For me, those are just the inferences that articulate the inferential roles of logical vocabulary. But what's important about the logical vocabulary is not so much its inferential role as its expressive role with respect to non-logical vocabulary. So I'm not much interested in logical consequence relations. I'm interested in the logical expression of material consequence relations.
Okay, thank you very much. And my last question is about the principle, this principle, expulse quod libet. In a recent paper commenting the book of Jarda Peregrine, you reject the classical principle of explosion, as also known as expulso quod libet and consequentia mirabilis. The principle says that from materially inconsistent premises, everything follows. The principle is completely alien to a pragmatist approach to logic and semantics, and your rejection of the principle is really passionate. you consider the principle not only false, but an embarrassment for teachers, proper of televangelists. I quite agree. And affirm that, I quote, it corresponds to nothing whatsoever in ordinary reasoning, that it's a pure artifact of classical logical machinery. Your position is the much reasonable one that from an inconsistent set of premises follows what follows from each one of its members and nothing else, and I agree. Nevertheless, you seem to accept a version of it proposed by one of your former students, Ulf Lobel, I don't know how to pronounce his name, ex fixo falso quod libet, EFFQ. The difference is that in this new version, EFFQ, the premise set is explicitly contradictory. That is, it contains A and not A, and thus not only it, but also every superset of it is inconsistent. Now, I cannot see the gain of including this new principle, EFFQ, among our logical principles, neither from a logical nor a pragmatist perspective. I cannot see why you don't apply to this case what you say about the classical principle, that is, that from contradictory premises follows what follows from one of them and from this negation and nothing else. Logical constants, negation included, have expressive meaning. They do not add any substantive information, but their role is making explicit some attitude. Then my question, there are three related questions. Why the explicit representation of an implicit incompatibility changes the status of the classical principle? The second one is, which would be those ordinary inferential practices that would correspond to the new principle, to EFFQ? And the third, in the connection with my former question number 6, radical semantic holism implies that A is inferentially related to everything that is not incompatible with it, and the same happens with its negation. Then A and not A together exhaust the logical space in Wittgensteinian terminology. Nevertheless, methodological pragmatism states that semantics must answer to pragmatics. So if the classical principle, ex falso quod libet, corresponds, in your words, to nothing whatsoever in ordinary reasoning, as you say, the same fate should run its stronger principle, its stronger new version. If we discovered that there is no ordinary practice that supports the new version, would you consider that this would be a reason against a radical version of semantic holism?
Good question. And it's quite possible that in the argument in the paper that you premise your question on, that I was misleading about the rhetorical situation, what I was taking for granted and what not. That is, my own view is that nothing about logical consequence actually reflects anything about material consequence. That's not the level at which there's an at which logical vocabulary is expressive of non-logical reasoning. It's logical claims that have to correspond, that is claims made in a logically extended language, a language you've added logical vocabulary to. Those claims explicitly codify features of basic reasoning. The logical consequence relations just articulate the inferential roles of the logical vocabulary. In ordinary practice, we don't use logical vocabulary, and so there isn't anything in our ordinary practice that they're answering to. Now, I was addressing my argument to the teacher of logic who is lying to their undergraduates and saying, look, I'm going to teach you to reason better by teaching you formal logic. And so is thinking that somehow behind every good inference, materially good inference, there's a logically good inference, a logically valid inference hidden somewhere in there. And their picture is, and I'm going to find that, I'm going to teach you how to find that, and you'll be a better reasoner. And now they say, oh, and by the way, if you have incompatible claims, then everything follows from it. Well, from your point of view, from what you're claiming logic is doing, thinking of it as a canon of right reasoning, thinking of good reasons as meaning logically good reasons, you ought to be embarrassed by that, because that that's not codifying anything about ordinary reasoning. Now, the specific context in which ex fixo falso quodlibet comes up is we're using logic to codify non-monotonic material consequence relations. And so when we have materially incompatible premise sets, it's entirely possible that incompatibility, that the incoherence of that premise set is curable. By adding further premises, you may end up with something that actually is coherent. That's not going to happen if you say that if you accept explosion of the consequences. Well, when could you accept that? Well, the strongest thing in the vicinity one could accept is if the material incompatibility you've got is incurable. If nothing that you added into it as further premises would yield a coherent premise set, well, then it doesn't matter what you take to follow from it. You're not going to be able to reason with it. Whereas if it's curable, well, then we better keep track of what materially follows from it. So the EFFQ is a sort of don't care. Those cases, you can have explosion if you like, and this had the advantage that the system collapses to classical logic if the underlying material consequence relation is monotonic, and you only look at implications that are persistent, that is, that continue to hold no matter what else you throw in with them. So in our logical system, we introduce a modal operator that says if from a premise set you can conclude A indefeasibly, so that no matter what else you added to the premise set, it would still follow, then we say, well, it's not just A that follows, but ox A. A follows persistently from it. And classical logic turns out to be the modal fragment of this larger logic. So it's a technical convenience to have EFFQ in it, but I don't assign any particular philosophical significance to it. It's just something we can put up with.
Okay, thank you very much, and that's all on my part. So thank you for your answer. It has been very illuminating, and I have learned a lot. And now, Wischin, who is the guest editor of this issue of Disputatio, wanted to ask you other two questions, if it is possible.
I'm by no means as knowledgeable about your philosophy as Maria Jose. She just introduced me to your philosophy some 2 years ago. I'm more some sort
I tried.
Well, if I fail, it's my failure. I'm more of an old-fashioned Wittgensteinian, and that paints my question to you. I will skip the first two, I think Maria Jose sent you, and I will just make the last one about the philosophical quietism or semantic nihilism you address in the new article you wrote for essentially for our review, some strands of Wittgenstein's normative pragmatism and some strains of his semantic nihilism. Essentially, in this article, you say that there is one argument that is very shallow, that says that Wittgenstein is an anti-scientism and that he is against using theoretical terms in an ontological way, and that this would be the reason that he cannot have a semantic theory, but because this would have us introduce meaning as a theoretical entity. You say this is not a good reason, and yeah, I think it's right, because I don't think this is the position of Wittgenstein actually. But then you say there is a lot of better reason for his semantic nihilism, that is that what you call a Procrustean enterprise of elaborating a semantic theory does not take into account the dynamism in which our language develops. But what you do is entirely different, that it takes precisely into account this dynamism, and what it does is create a meta-linguistic approach to studying our use of language. Now, what I doubt about this is that Wittgenstein was very anxious not to let us theorize about everything in philosophy, anything in philosophy. He was afraid that the very moment we lose contact with our real use in language, we will fall into traps that language sets up for us. And I wonder how you arm yourself against such traps in your meta-philosophical approach to linguistics.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's various ways in which one can be in contact with the rough ground that is so important to him, and that contact is maintained by appropriate philosophical theorizing, in my view, if one is introducing vocabulary with the specific expressive task of letting you say explicitly how ground level expressions are used. Wittgenstein himself prefers to give us suggestive anecdotes that will remind us of features of the use of the expressions. And I wouldn't claim that it was a reasonable aspiration. I would not claim that it's a reasonable aspiration to make explicit all of the use of any expression. But I do think it's sensible, it's a sensible aspiration to try and say explicitly, to make explicit some features of the use of important ground level expressions, to say something about their inferential roles or the pragmatic force that their utterance can have. The way I would think about it, we keep control of that pragmatic meta vocabulary by stipulating how we're using it in language that we take ourselves to understand well enough to do that. And then the expressive role that it plays in making explicit features of the use of ground level vocabulary keeps us in contact with, keeps us controlled by those practices of using the ground level vocabulary. So it seems to me we're not unusually in danger of this metalinguistic vocabulary going on holiday because we've kept explicit control over the use of the new vocabulary by tying it to the use of the vocabulary that it has the expressive job of making explicit. So it seems to me that in that way we can keep our use of the pragmatic meta vocabulary from being metaphysically puzzling in the way that he diagnoses when we carry over an analogy of the way some bit of the language works to the way some other bit of the language works when actually there's significant disanalogies.
So would it be fair to say that you don't really construct a theory in the way Wittgenstein criticizes, but rather you take his descriptive ways to a new level, where you just include the expressive role of the meta vocabulary, but you don't construct a theoretical building out of that?
Right. I would like to think of it that way, because the task isn't an explanatory task, but an expressive task. I mean, he wants us to describe the use of these things, and I'm suggesting that that's compatible with systematically using meta vocabulary to do it. And that's the way I understand philosophical vocabulary, for instance, the logical vocabulary we were just talking about,
right,
to make explicit inferential commitments.
Well, yeah, right. Well, thank you very much. I have nothing else to ask at this moment, and as soon as everything is prepared, we will stay in touch with you. Thank you very, very much.
Okay.
Thank you both.
Well, thank
It
you.
has been great.
Okay. Well,
you
it's a pleasure for me. So
Pleasure.
thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.